Hey YouTube, I know it's been a little bit, but I had a little bit of an epiphany last night. Maybe? We'll find out. I gotta talk through it. So this is gonna be another episode of Belief Bricks. So let's get started. So last night, as I was laying in bed, and I was, tossing and turning and trying to go to sleep and thinking about all the existential things in the world, I started to think about what is consciousness. And I think what prompted this thought process was actually because I recently watched a TikTok. One of the people I follow. Oh, hello, Beerus. New cat. Well, newish. So she was doing her normal walk outside, and she was like, oh, all the people are, mowing their lawns or whatever. And she was like, do you know what that freshly cut grass smell is? And she said, it's grass's way of telling other plants that there's danger in the area, right? So that, like she was talking about, plants communicate to each other via smell, right? And we know, like, plants pollinate and all this stuff. And we also know that plants, whether inadvertently or not, communicate with animals that live in conjunction with plants. For example, bees and flowers. Bees pollinate, help to cross-pollinate and all that kind of stuff. And even if it's an inadvertent communication, it's still a communication, right? So we don't just communicate with words. We communicate, like humans in general, we communicate kind of with all of our senses, but mainly with voice and body language, ASL, seeing each other, motions, that kind of thing. So we could say that our eyes and our ears are our / mouth, whatever, is our primary form of communication, but touch is also a form of communication. If two people are holding hands with each other, that is not only a communication between the two of them, the one that holds the other person's hand, like I like you, I care for you, whatever, but it's also a communication to other people, like we care for each other because we're doing this in public or whatever. And I started thinking about it. I'm like, okay, so what is consciousness? Because I would say, so we know humans are conscious beings. I would say animals are as well. And when I think about why animals are conscious, it's like, well, I can communicate with my dog. It's not as well as I can communicate with another human, but my dog and I communicate, my cats and I communicate in our own ways. They tell me when they're hungry. They tell me when they want something. My dog tells me when she has to go to the bathroom. I tell my dog when she's done a good job, when she's done a bad job, when I love her, that kind of thing. And we're able to communicate. Well, then if we talk about like plants and trees and things having consciousness as well, is it because they are able to communicate with one another via smell? Or scent. So if we kind of go through this whole, all right, so there's consciousness is determined by, if it's determined by your ability to communicate, then how do we talk about the difference between, like, what's the difference between consciousness and divinity? So different religions will define divinity in different ways, of course. So for example, if you go to any Christian, most of the time, they define divinity or God as an omniscient, all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful being, right? But if you go to, let's say, the Greek pantheon, they're not necessarily all-knowing. They're not necessarily all-powerful. They each have their own abilities. And they're also not, like, above human issues or whatever. Like, they suffer from jealousy and anger, rage, whatever. Like, they're not perfect, they're not perfect beings. Whereas in Christianity, God is supposed to be perfect and, like what you ascribe to be, what you want to be. Whereas in other pantheons, specifically like polytheistic pantheons, the gods aren't necessarily, like, yes, they can be, like, as a whole, they may be all powerful, but individually they may not be, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to offend anybody. I'm just trying to be, like, unbiased here. So then what is divinity? And I looked it up. I Googled divinity definition. Of course, the first thing that came up was divinity is the state of being divine. And I'm like, that's a crap definition. Like, that you can't use the root word to describe that. Like, that's so dumb. Like, that's not a real definition. That's something that we teach, that I taught as an English teacher. Like, that's a crap definition. Don't use that as a definition. Like, you can't do that. So then I look up, okay, so what's definition of divine? And it's something along the lines of like of a deity, being a deity, or being like a deity, or being of a deity, or something like that. Another one said providence or God. So I looked up providence. Providence is basically the ability to the ability to have or provide spiritual protection, I believe is what it was, if I'm remembering correctly. But I'm like, okay, so if providence is divinity, or providence is God, which is divinity, the ability to provide spiritual protection, witches can do that for ourselves. We have the ability in our spirituality to provide spiritual protection for ourselves. Now, in some cases, depending on what kind of witch you are or whatever, you may ask for a god's help in that endeavor, or you may look at it as energy work. You may look at it, a number of different ways. So then, if we think about, especially if you think about providing spiritual protection being energy work, which is kind of how I practice in general, is with like energy work type of stuff, like seeing everything in the universe as energy and movements of energy and manipulating energy for, my own gain or the gain of people around me or whatever. If you look at it that way, then you're basically saying the ability to manipulate energy is divinity. And then if you look at consciousness as the ability to communicate, isn't communication just a manipulation of energy? I mean, it's a type of manipulation of energy, right? So then, is consciousness divinity? This also ties into the idea that there may be pieces of God or divinity in everyone, right? We all have some divine aspect or that higher self, or, basically that piece of the universe, right? That we're all one. This idea that, at the base of it, we're all we're all from the same source type of thing. So then if divinity is source energy, is the ability to communicate, then then basically we're all it's that whole namaste thing. Like the divine in me greets the divine in you. The divinity in me, the source energy in me greets the source energy in you. And being able to communicate with each other, whether that's through speech or, hand gestures or body language or smell or music or whatever. Yeah. I don't know. I went on a ramble. Sorry for this stream of consciousness, but I got it out now. And just makes me think a little bit more about how I view the world spiritually and how I interact with the world. Because then you think about, at death, when your consciousness leaves your body, basically, because what is that? When, if your consciousness is your soul or whatever, when you die, your life, the life inside of you, that spark, somehow leaves your body or whatever. if it's just source energy, then it just rejoins with everything, right? So give me your thoughts. Let me know what you think. Yeah. Have a great day, guys.